They don't even try.
Right.
And something like this could go for.
It looks like it did. Judging by the little bend on the bottom, it looks like it's been dragging for a long time. See on the corner?
Hoses.
Let me see.
I don't know what that's all about. You know what? This. Here, take these out of here.
Put that other set in there. We got a better set.
The bus is all happy. Oh, finally somebody's looking after me.
Finally, somebody cares. Oh, two.
But you know, I hate that. I guess other bus fans and all can. Nobody seems to get into this, and the problem is they don't have all the materials. But I've been buying this shit for years. You know.
Yep. It looks like the panel that you're screwing it onto is moving too.
Yeah, there it goes. I know one thing. I didn't work on this. I would have never done this way.
Right.
I wonder if this thing got hit or something, maybe. Because this is loose. Oh shit, sorry. Sorry about this. I just think of all the buses, you know, I've played around with it, the other types and all that. These were well engineered. You know, they really were. But as I tell you, the motive behind it is money. GM didn't do this because they wanted to design something. They were told to do this.
By who?
They wanted to by the upper management. See, truck and coach is a separate section of General Motors, and the management said, build something that will bury the competition. It's exactly what they did.
Wow.
Engineering of these buses, one thing about Fishbowls, if you look at them carefully, everything is concord. It's got curves. The glass, everything you can see has got curves to it. Where most buses are like school buses, they're just boxes.
Right.
And I think that's where GM really passed everybody up.
So how they get all the ideas to make this new bus as opposed to the old ones? I mean,
Well, what they did, pretty slick. They sent people to all the bus companies to interview drivers and interview mechanics. Now, a lot of times when these guys engineer stuff, they don't spend much time in the field trying to see what the problems are. And so, with the Fishbowl, they did that. They went out there and they talked to drivers. And one of the things the drivers said is there's too many blind spots. On the old looks, there were too many blind spots, you know. And another problem they ran into was a big, tall driver. He had a hard time with the old looks, looking out the windshield, and the same was true of their short driver, and the same thing with drivers that were fat. All different physical conditions, and so they wanted to design a windshield that fit everybody. And that's what this is. Short guy, tall guy, everybody can adjust to it, and a minimal of blind spots.
that's why those posts are so thin.
And
They are pretty thin.
And that's where they came up with the idea. But keep in mind, don't think that they were doing it because they wanted to be. They were doing it for money. They knew if they could get something where they could beat the competition, But that's exactly what they were going to do, and they did it. And then they got themselves in real trouble.
Why?
Antitrust.
Oh yeah, you don't hear that very
The
often.
Flexible boys got smart, and they got a good lawyer, and the lawyer found out that they were monopolizing the bus business. Didn't go over well. And therefore, General Motors became very worried that the corporation could be split up and so they decided then to see up to 1966 or 68 or so, you could not buy a transverse engine. You could not buy any of the parts that they use on these buses. They're strictly GM. And in 1968, they created Detroit Diesel, they created Allison, Rockwell, so that anybody could buy them, meaning Flexible could now buy the very same thing the GMs had to compete. In other words, they made the bus so good, they had to give all their secrets away for fear that they would affect Pontiac and Chevy and Buick. That to them was far more important than the buses.
I get it. Sell more cars than buses, probably.
They made a lot more money. So they were not about to let... They were making about 6,000 buses a year. They were not about to let a 6,000 inventory of vehicles versus Chevy makes that in 2 weeks. And so they were not about to let the bus business bring the corporation down.
So then Flexible could start putting GM stuff in their buses and make them better.
That's exactly what happened in 1968. And anybody could buy anything, and the components that. And in other words, they allowed Flexible to compete with GM because they became almost identical.
So how
The
did?
only thing that was different was the body, but mechanically they were just about the same.
So
The
how
only
did?
time in history that ever happened.
How did Flexible wind up looking like Fishbowls later on?
Well, no, they had come up with a design about the same time when the Fishbowls came out in 1960, which was similar. It was just squared off. And the reason why it was squared off was because when you go to manufacturing places where they build the steel, etc., and all that, it's a lot more money for them to create curves and bends. A lot more expensive. That's the reason why they had flat glass in the front. Almost all buses have flat glass. Well, it's cheaper.
Oh, okay.
Well, GM, because they were so big, they could simply go to the people who make the windshields for Pontiacs and Chevys and say, hey, you make this windshield for our buses. And they weren't about to turn GM down because they were making so much money.
Right.
So GM had that advantage. The same thing is true with all the car lines and all the designs. GM was able to put all these curves and contours in that the other companies couldn't afford to do.
Blue, let me see you. Blue. Hi, Blue.
So they created, in my opinion, one of the best vehicles ever made because they took so much time to compete. They were not out to be number one. They were number one in sales is what they wanted. They were doing the same thing on the railroads. They wanted to bury the competition. Well, unfortunately, in this country, we do have an antitrust law that says that no one company can monopolize one business. And GM at one time was approaching 90% of all the buses being sold. So they were in trouble.
Wow.
And that's what happened. And as soon as GM realized that, they made their mind up in the 70s that they wanted out of the bus business. They were totally wanted to give it up. And they did at the end of 1976. But for other legal reasons and pressure on them, they were forced to build the RTS. They certainly didn't want to.
But didn't they wind up helping Flexible in some way?
Well, certainly they went over to Flexible and redesigned their bus so that it was identical to theirs.
Why?
So that when, at that time, everybody was buying, a lot of the companies now were municipal or government operations, that the law said that the low bidder was the one who got the bid. So GM got together with their people and they went to Flexible and say, keep quiet, sit in the corner over there, and we're going to make you money. Just shut up. We'll take care of it. That's exactly what they did. They coerced a lot to jimmy the bids. It was illegal what they were doing, and they were manipulating the bids. And by 1975 or so, Flexible was now producing more than GM. In other words, GM started to get under the 50%, which means they were no longer the dominant builder.
That's what they wanted, though.
And that's what they wanted. And they figured as soon as they got down low enough, they say goodbye to the bus business. So, in the meantime, Flexible was having all this business. It was expanding. They needed a factory. So they went to build a factory in Delaware, Ohio, and the bank turned them down. They would not loan them the money to build the plant. Well, so happened that that bank was one that General Motors was depositing in. So the General Motors people went to that bank and said, either you make that loan or we'll take our money out of our bank, out of your bank. That's exactly what happened. Now you probably say, well, how would I know that? Well, John McCain was a good friend of mine. He was a big researcher, and he spent the time and actually talked to one of the managers at the bank and confirmed that's exactly what happened.
Wow.
And so they were able to build their plant, and they were putting out more buses, and that allowed GM, by the end of 1976, to say goodbye. And that's exactly what they told everybody: goodbye. We're not building the VH and VS transmissions. At the end of the year, we're through. It's been nice knowing you. Have a good day. Goodbye. But they made one major mistake. They had taken $5 million from the government to create the RTX. And the government was putting a lot of pressure on them that said, you can't abandon this because you took our money. And they went back and forth trying to figure out what to do about it. And they even went so far to reopen the plant for 2 weeks to build 11 4523s for Wausau, Wisconsin, provided that Wausau would back off getting RTSs. They wanted the RTSs. They were talked out of it, and GM made them a special deal. They built the buses. They're the only buses that were ever built with V730s in the United States. This, of course, made everybody upset. Anyway, GM was determined to say goodbye, and they literally did not want to build the RTS. And when the RTS was created, the GM coach and truck division laughed at them, said it wouldn't work, and it's too many problems. And the bus was so critically different from a Fishbowl that they simply turned it over to the truck division to finish the designing on it. It did become a GM trucking coach, but it was actually designed by the truck people. That's why they're so critically different from the Fishbowl.
They didn't mind doing it, the truck division? They didn't mind doing it?
Well, they work for GM. They're going to do whatever they tell them.
Oh, okay.
And that's exactly what happened. That's how, and then that only lasted until 1986 when GM finally sold what was left to MCI.
RTS went to MCI.
That's right, RTSs, and that's all they were making. But everything, all their design, the whole thing was moved to Roswell, New Mexico.
But so they could put UFO engines in them?
Well, they were right next to the people who did it.
So did the RTS bus wind up being a good bus?
Well, no, in my opinion. A lot of people argue with me. I think it was a poorly designed bus. GM should have been ashamed of the things they did. But overall, what it had to compete with, it was probably better than the others. But the RTS weighed 5,400 pounds more than a Fishbowl. They were getting horrible fuel mileage, 2.8 to 3.2 miles per gallon.
Oh my God!
And at that time, everybody was on a kick to get mileage down and mileage up. That was, and then of course the RTS went the other way. The brakes were wedge brakes because the bus was so heavy it wouldn't stop with S-cam brakes. There's a lot of things they did. They did independent front axle, the wheels, which turned out to be a nightmare. And they also put the air conditioning next to the radiator, which was another disaster. And the Fishbowls all had them on the roof, and later they had to put them back on the roof to correct their mistake. And later they put Fishbowl axles on it. About 1974 or so, 75, they did away with the independent front axle and went back to a Fishbowl axle and called it an improvement. So you have an idea of how the whole story went. Bottom line, money. Money is what caused this to happen. Money is the reason they did all this. And it wasn't because, they decided on Sunday they were coming up with a good bus. They were told to make a good, they were told to bury the competition. That's exactly what they did. And they did the same thing in the railroading. The railroads did the same thing with their GP units and their electromotive units, which were part of GM. Everybody preferred the GM over everybody else. And the same thing happened over there, although they were never sued for antitrust. So the bus business, the Fishbowl bus, actually led to the downfall of GM.
As far as the buses were concerned.
It was so good, it turned out to be bad.
That's awesome.